Today is not no, we didn't know ah, go ahead. Two more. Okay, now we start. Free space here. È andato in bagno. Ah, okay. So I think we can start. Is someone of the students still missing, or they are coming? Well, yeah, but 6 o'clock was. So are they? Where are they? Okay. So are we waiting for how many minutes? Can we know how long do we have to?
They start.
We start? Sure. Everybody agree we start? Okay. So I'm very happy of having with us Matthew Gandy. Unfortunately, a little bit distant, but Matthew, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And as I was just telling him, I hope that we can invite him for maybe in the next semester, or when you are available, Matt, just tell us when it's possible. So I'm very happy because I've never met, in fact, Matthew Gandy, but I know him since many years as a fundamental author in political ecology, or say urban political ecology. So for all those that are interested to this, you have to know he's a very important reference in this field. And at this moment, I hope it's not wrong, but you are a member of the King College of Cambridge University. Is it correct?
Yes.
Yes, good. And he's the author of many publications. Let's just maybe remember Concrete and Clay, a book that received several prizes. He founded the Urban Laboratory at UCL in 2005. Say kind of a very innovative type of urban laboratory. He also realizes movies. This I didn't know, that you're also a video maker or a movie makers. And one of those movies, Liquid City, 2007, which explores the complexity of water politics. So he has worked a lot, Matthew, about water issues in terms of political, of course, and ecological issues. Another book from him, The Fabric of Space, Mass Water, Modernity, and the Urban Imagination, 2015. And then we have a new book, but it is also a movie, no? Natura Urbana. Matthew, Natura Urbana is a movie, not just a book.
Yes, there's a documentary about Berlin. And,
a documentary, okay.
Exactly. And then the book is looking at a whole series of themes, exactly. Okay,
very, very interesting. I discovered, looking at your publication, that you also published something about Paris Heterotopia.
It's a translation of some work I did in London that caught the attention of some critical theorists. So they translated it into French to bring it to a wider audience. Ah,
okay. Let's say his reflection, as I said, is related to political ecology, but in particular, he has worked a lot on the notion of urban metabolism. but proposing, let's say, kind of original way to look at this very central and crucial metaphor, and by proposing to read a different dimension. So maybe, I don't know if Matthew, you will speak a little bit about that. I suppose maybe yes. So I'm not going to expand too much. And you are very interested in grounded theories. I have just I've recently heard to your one of your podcasts, the one you realized with Aristide Athanasiadis in Brussels. I don't know exactly when, but Aristide is also working here at the EPFL with us, and he's a colleague that I also like a lot. So I found interesting, because we also are very much convinced that the theories are grounded somewhere. They are not just coming from the sky. So I think that this is maybe enough to have all the full attention of the students for this conference. And again, I want to thank you for your time and for your generosity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to share my screen, so let's hope it works. Yeah, I think, is that okay? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
That's great. And you can hear me as well?
Yeah, super.
Okay, so well, look, thanks so much for the very kind introduction, and thank you also for inviting me. So I'm going to present some ideas from my new book, and also hopefully raise some questions which we can open up to discussion as well. So I think a starting point would be to say that with my book, Natura Urbana, I've tried to bring together a range of work and ideas over recent years concerning my interest in urban nature. And one of the big challenges in writing this book was trying to make sense of a vast and growing literature on the question of urban nature and urban ecologies, how to navigate this huge intellectual terrain, to try to find our way through this. And also, of course, during the writing of this book, we experienced the COVID-19 lockdown. So some of the writing was done from my kitchen table under lockdown, and very much thinking about what it means to focus on, if you like, the nature on our doorstep, and to reevaluate aspects of ecology and green space within the contemporary city. Also, I think I realized when this book came out in spring this year, that it was exactly 20 years after my book, Concrete and Clay, Reworking Nature in New York City. And I realized, comparing these two pieces of work, that my book, Concrete and Clay, had been very much concerned with what I term metropolitan nature. So these are constructed fragments of nature within the modern metropolis, water systems, parks, infrastructure, and so on. Whereas with the current book, my emphasis has shifted somewhat towards spontaneous ecological assemblages within the contemporary city. So a shift, if you like, from metropolitan to spontaneous forms of nature. And in trying to make sense of this very complex field, I moved towards a separation or typology of the literature into four main areas. The systems-based approach, which, as I will suggest, is really the dominant approach across many key disciplines concerned with urban nature and urban space. Secondly, observational paradigms, which I'll suggest sketch a connection from 19th century natural history to contemporary fields such as citizen science. Thirdly, the field of urban political ecology, emerging particularly from the 1990s onwards, and a field with which my own work has been very closely associated and linking particularly with neo-Marxian perspectives on urban space. And then fourthly, and most recently, what I'm referring to as the ecological pluriverse and growing interest in multi-species urbanism. So to begin then, the systems-based approach, I think perhaps the first thing to say is that in a lot of the textbooks about urban ecology and aspects of urban nature, there's a kind of an assumption, if you like, that the first major intervention is to be found with the Chicago School of Urban Sociology, who made extensive use of metaphors, particularly botanical metaphors, such as plant succession, to understand processes of neighborhood change. And the Chicago School of Urban Sociology in the 1920s and 1930s are very much rooted in an atomistic, competition-based model of modern societies and urban space. But it's fair to say that, in fact, the Chicago School had very little direct interest in ecology or urban nature. And if we're to look for a fully developed systems-based model, which really does link ecological science to the understanding of urban space, then I think we need to look to what we might refer to as the Brussels School, and in particular the contribution of Paul Duvigneau, who, as a tropical ecologist, he was exploring the trophic dynamics of rainforests in West Africa, and then at a later stage applied these trophic metabolic models to conceptualizing the city of Brussels. So he really developed then a metabolic conception of urban space as a flow, as a set of measurable flows of energy and materials. And this quantitative flow-based approach has also been picked up by other scholars, such as Marina Fischer-Kowalski, with the industrial metabolism approach, the so-called Vienna School, we might say, which is a later but related dimension to the Brussels School. And adding into this notion of a quantitative or even mechanistic perception of urban space, we have classic contributions such as Abel Wollman's essay, The Metabolism of Cities, from 1965. Now, this systems-based and model-oriented approach has picked up increasing momentum. So in recent years in North America, for example, we have the Baltimore School of Urban Ecology, which interestingly sees itself as the natural successor to the Chicago School. And the Baltimore School really conceptualizes urban space as a set of intersecting social and ecological systems. And this systems-based approach, as I've suggested, has really emerged as the dominant approach in relation to conceptualizing urban nature and urban ecology, with strong links to resilience discourse, landscape urbanism, and other fields. And linked with this perspective, we also have a range of influential textbooks as well. The work of Marina Alberti is another example. And when we look across this field then of this dominant systems-based approach, there is an emphasis on epistemological unity between the biophysical and social sciences. In other words, it's more or less assumed that with sufficient data and so on, everything can be linked together and analyzed in some kind of holistic, explanatory or analytical framework. also within these works, there is an implicit naturalization of the global capitalist economy and also capitalist urbanization itself. It's notable that, if you like, alternative perspectives on the urban itself are largely absent from within the systems-based model. And I mentioned a second ago the closeness to resilience discourse, and I would argue the closeness to the adaptive Anthropocene. In other words, a certain set of assumptions about the capacity of systems to adapt and respond to processes of environmental change, so that the systems-based approach then has become part of a wider conceptual movement associated with more market-oriented conceptions of the adaptive Anthropocene. Now, if that then in many ways is the dominant approach, as ecology and urban nature is actually taught in pedagogic programs and also within professional practice and so on, I want to move on to a rather different approach within this typology that I sketched. And that is the set of ideas associated with what I've termed observational paradigms. Now, these approaches to urban space we could perhaps trace to the growing 19th century fascination with ruins and waste spaces. And among the 19th century studies that really epitomizes this emerging set of observational paradigms is Richard Deakin's study, this image on the left here, his Flora of the Colosseum in Rome from 1855. And as a botanist with a fascination for urban ruins, he records over 400 different species of plants growing on the ruins of the Colosseum, including many species from North Africa and further afield. So it's an early example of a fascination with a kind of a cosmopolitan ecology, if you like, in relation to urban ruins. And other botanists through the 19th century also begin to develop a fascination with unusual types of urban flora, so-called ballast flora associated with ports, where ships moved materials around to keep their balance at sea and then discarded earth and stones and other material in different ports that they visited. Also, we can find fascinating early studies of industrial floras in Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and elsewhere. So this emerging fascination then with unusual ecologies related to urban and industrial spaces. Now, this emphasis on the unusual or the novel in urban space also, in the wake of wartime destruction, became a focus of interest. So the image on the right here is one of the so-called bomb sites in London being studied by botanists. And in a number of European cities, these void spaces or bomb sites became a focus of post-war fascination, the Trümmerlandschaften or rubble landscapes in German cities, for example. And particularly in Berlin, there was the emergence of what we might refer to as the Berlin school of urban ecology, closely associated with new developments in urban botany. And within these emerging botanical movements, a fascination for, if you like, signature plants, Dysphania botrytis here, the sticky-leaved goosefoot, as a plant that was a Mediterranean plant from much warmer climates that flourished in these post-war rubble landscapes, and for botanists became a kind of symbol of these sort of ecological tabula rasa and the emergence of these new unusual ecologies. And just as a footnote, perhaps, in making the documentary film about Berlin, which I've completed just a few years ago, it was very difficult to find any of these plants because so many of these sites have been developed and built over. But we managed to find an example of Dysphania botrytis in a car park alongside many other interesting species from all over the world. And the Berlin School of Urban Ecology was notable in terms of its extremely intricate and complex cartographic programs to examine all of the varied biotopes, particularly within the island city of West Berlin. Because of the geopolitical division of Berlin, the scientists, the botanists and others within the island city had to focus their attention effectively inwards and looking in enormous detail at the ecological dynamics of the island city, producing these extremely interesting maps. Note the strange grayed out spaces of the DDR that are not included within this ecological imaginary. And importantly, the botanists and ecologists in Berlin developed what we could describe as a biotope mapping regime that the sociologist Jens Lachemand has described in detail, that began to influence aspects of land use planning policy. So they became actively engaged in trying to argue for the importance of these unusual ecological sites in the city and trying to develop an argument to protect some of these sites. Most of their study sites were lost, but nevertheless, they built up this intense interest in trying to argue for how to protect these unusual sites. And in terms of my own work in Berlin, there was a particular site. I should say that the German word Brache is widely used in relation to these urban wastelands. There was a particular Brache just off the Chausseestrasse in Berlin that I first visited in the early 2000s and then did a long-term study of, that in many ways has inspired me towards this larger program of work. And in the introduction, mention was made of a ground level research or ground level theory. And I think it's very interesting to me how an immersion in a specific site can really enrich the research or theoretical imagination. This is of great interest to me, this relationship between material specificities and forms of conceptual imagination. And in this site then, there were certain plants which were typical of these urban wastelands, such as Etienne vulgari, this very attractive blue plant. And also, I should mention that my main ecological interest is actually invertebrates and insects. There was, for example, a very interesting species of moth that I encountered, which actually was associated originally with drier steppe type landscapes in Ukraine or Russia to the east, but was gradually extending its range to take advantage of these drier, hotter urban environments, such as this waste space in the Chausseestrasse. And in terms of a sort of methodological approach here, I've suggested in a recent essay that I was trying to develop a kind of ecological ethnography in terms of going repeatedly back to the same site to make observations, but also develop theoretical ideas, and also trying to link that with memory studies because this site doesn't exist anymore. It's been cleared to make way for a luxury residential project. So that's also interesting to me. What is the significance analytically, conceptually in relation to sites that no longer exist? How do we relate ecological concerns with memory studies? Is another related aspect that I've been very, very much interested in. And this question of the specificity of the urban has developed a set of very interesting literature on novel ecosystems and new natures, or the idea of urban laboratories as spaces of future nature. And in relation to London and many other European cities, an addition to the avian fauna is the rose-ringed parakeet, which is now a familiar sight in London and many other cities, and also divides opinion as well, that there are some people who try to claim that the presence of birds like the rose-ringed parakeet is an invasive species. And there are deep ideological tensions around the definition of invasiveness, and also the meaning of native or non-native within the context of an urban cosmopolitan socio-ecological assemblage. What do these different ecological terms mean in that precise context? So related then to this fascination in the literature with the specificities of urban ecology is a growing recognition that levels of urban biodiversity are not only very high, but very often higher than the kind of monocultural agricultural hinterlands beyond metropolitan space, partly because of this enormous range of different biotopes that exist within urban space. And so there's quite a lot of interesting literature now in terms of, what are the most biodiverse cities in the world. And in fact, I think Cape Town in South Africa emerges most frequently as the example of the city with particularly in relation to plants, having the greatest number of recorded species. But we could also turn the question slightly differently and reflect for a moment on what are the cities where we find the most intense research and analysis of urban nature and urban ecology. And there we find cities such as Brussels, Berlin, Hong Kong features very highly, Montreal, New York, Rotterdam. There are these very often long-standing intense research programs in relation to specific cities. And to link this then to this broader sweep of observational paradigms, I'm suggesting that these in many ways differ from the systems-based approach because they're interested in the ground level specificities of urban nature, and in particular, the kind of value to be gained from meticulous, sometimes long-term studies of specific sites. And I'm suggesting also that the observational paradigms can be linked with citizen science and an expanded notion of the relationship between science and the public sphere. And to give an illustration of a project that I'm involved with, I'm involved in recording species of butterflies and moths, both in London, but also in the Berlin-Brandenburg region. And just to illustrate here, it is actually a kind of moth that is a wasp mimic, which is already an extremely interesting ecological strategy that's associated with particular plants growing in these ruderal ecologies. And then I can send my observations to the larger project, and then my observation is included in these cartographic maps, and I'm listed as one of the recorders here. Apparently, the first sighting of this particular species for 20 years in this particular quadrat in Berlin. So this sense of citizen science as a kind of involvement and also enrichment of urban nature is very interesting to me. And these kind of programs also applying to plants, birds, and also tree health. The monitoring of potential damage to trees, also very important within this citizen science approach. But perhaps my final comment on the observational paradigms is the link to the arts science interface. And here a number of artists have used scientific methods, ecological sampling methods, to develop distinctive cultural insights into urban space. So the Brazilian artist Maria Teresa Alves, with her Seeds of Change project, has been looking at these ballast floras I mentioned associated with shipping and ports. And she's explored these unusual combinations of plants to link port cities to historical processes such as global trade and the rise of European colonialism and colonial networks, including slavery in the case of Liverpool, one of the cities included in her study. And the idea that for Albers and other artists that urban soils, for example, constitute a kind of botanical archive that can be brought back to life and form part of building a much richer understanding of the histories of urban ecology. So I'm going to move on now to the third approach within my typology, that of urban political ecology. And I think that this field is one of the reasons why this field is particularly of interest, I think, is because it takes such a different analytical vantage point, particularly from the systems-based approach, that it starts off from a different conceptualization of capitalist urbanization right from the start. So it presents a fundamentally different vantage point. And the edited collection from 2006, The Nature of Cities, is clearly a kind of landmark in terms of bringing together ideas in relation to what's sometimes referred to as the first wave of urban political ecology. And in terms of the broader scope of this approach, we can say that whilst political ecology, which really developed in the 70s and 80s, was geared more towards rural resource politics in the global south. Think of Michael Watt's work on a famine in Nigeria, for example. But through the emergence of urban political ecology, the lens of political ecology really shifts somewhat towards an urban context, including many metropolitan centers within the global north. And in terms of my earlier work in New York City, I was particularly interested in the emergence of the environmental justice movement and some of the earliest explicit challenges through social movements to urban environments, things like bad housing, lead poisoning, inadequate refuse collection, and so on. A very different set of issues from much of the existing ecological literature. And as I mentioned a second ago, the urban political ecology really emerging out of the political ecology paradigm from studies within the global south, and Michael Watts in particular stands out. But I would also suggest, however, unlike some of the literature, that we need to be aware of another contributory intellectual strand related to aspects of urban history. Here we could go back, I think, to some of the early accounts of living conditions in rapidly growing industrial towns and cities, the work of Friedrich Engels, particularly his work in Manchester in Northern England. So that this analytical interest, if you like, in urban environmental conditions, I would argue, is not just a matter of the shift of focus of political ecology from global south to global north. There are other strands to bring in here. Other influences that we could also point to include, of course, the Frankfurt School and the extremely important emerging critiques of science and technology. And building on some of these earlier insights, the American philosopher Andrew Feenberg, with his work on alternative modernity, I found especially interesting, for example, in relation to light technologies and light pollution, and thinking through the presence of alternative pathways through modernity, alternative socio-technological pathways, and what the wider political implications might be in relation to a different framing of relationships between nature and technology. Also, of course, of great influence within urban political ecology are the formative interventions from Donna Haraway and breaking down dualistic conceptions of nature. And more recently, other anthropologists such as Stefan Helmreich, Anna Tsing, and others have also clearly been influential within this radical conceptualization of nature. And in terms of the field of urban political ecology, possibly from within geography, the most influential contribution has been of the Belgian geographer Erik Swingedouw. When we think about Swingedouw's earlier research in the 1990s, early 90s, or even starting in the late 80s, possibly in Guayaquil in Ecuador, and presenting a fundamentally different understanding of urban metabolism, not a mechanistic or systems-based model, but a notion of a double circulatory dynamic between the circulation of capital and the circulation of water within urban infrastructure. So a fundamentally different conceptualization of urban metabolism, also forming part of this emerging field of urban political ecology. And I mentioned in passing the environmental justice movement, also of fundamental importance to this field of work, linking between social movements in the past, in the late 60s through the 1990s, Bullard's formative work in relation to toxic waste, and more recently, environmental activism in so-called Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And interestingly, some of the activists in Louisiana and elsewhere adopt environmental, technical aspects of environmental monitoring that the state won't provide. So there's almost what you could describe as a regulatory mirroring, that local people are doing their own environmental monitoring, following scientific protocols extremely carefully, because the state is not taking any active role in monitoring for toxins and pollution within the environment. So these toxic landscapes then of critical significance. Having introduced then some of these formative aspects to urban political ecology, I think it's worth mentioning that this field is really at a crossroads, and there are some very interesting emerging challenges that I want to briefly raise that might also feed into our discussion later. I think that one significant challenge is that urban political ecology often hasn't really engaged that closely with ecological science itself or the campaigning role of ecologists. And here I think the work of the sociologist Jens Lachmann is very interesting, because I mentioned earlier that some of the urban ecologists and botanists in Berlin were scientists and also activists in relation to land use planning policy. And one of the distinctive legacies of a politicized urban ecology is the protection of the Südgelände, former railway sites in Berlin, which is now a kind of nature park, but it's also a legacy of a very specific moment in terms of the interface between ecology and urban politics and science and land use planning. Another aspect that urban political ecology perhaps hasn't really fully explored concerns the complexities of agency in urban space. And this example from the percussionist and sound artist, Marion Royards, is an attempt in notational form to present the echoes in railway arches. But what it also does, I think, is highlight the complexity of different forms of subjectivity in urban space, the interplay of human subjectivity, materials, in many instances, other human subjectivities, non-human nature, and so on. And in a sense, highlighting the complexity of agency and subjectivity in urban space, with links to affect theory, perhaps approaches to phenomenology and other fields. So these areas have perhaps been neglected within urban political ecology. Another point of discussion and contestation is really in relation to space and a tension, if you like, between aspects of what's sometimes referred to as planetary urbanization and the ecological, cultural, and political specificities of the metropolitan realm, which is a very interesting area of debate. And I simply wanted to show this image here from a recent exhibition of the work of the Berlin Weimar era planner, Martin Wagner, just to really highlight how do the specificities, let's say, of Weimar era urban planning and innovative approaches to urban nature, how do these historical and geographical specificities fit within a movement towards some form of planetary urbanization as a conceptual framework for understanding cities? In other words, the question underlying a lot of recent debate is what is the urban, and is there such a thing as non-urban? And in this particular context, what is the analytical status of metropolitan space within these theoretical frameworks? And it's something that I've been thinking about recently. Another area of discussion and contestation perhaps concerns urban epidemiology and the possibility for urban political ecology to make a distinctive contribution to understanding disease and ill health in cities and urban space. And we look at diseases like dengue or Zika in this case, and there are very clear relationships with patterns of urbanization, informal housing, particular kinds of micro-topographies in poorer neighborhoods, for example, where there's inadequate or absent supplies of water. Many people are storing available water in various receptacles and containers, and these can provide breeding sites for dangerous Aedes mosquitoes that carry Zika, dengue, and other illnesses. So the question then for me really is that can urban political ecology bring a distinctive perspective to the question of urban epidemiology? And I think there are some signs through the work of Roger Kyle, also Neil Brenner and others, that is beginning to become an important and interesting field of work. Another area perhaps where urban political ecology hasn't been so certain is in relation to ecological imaginaries, and also the growth of what we might describe as the environmental humanities, which are becoming a very important field of discussion and debate in relation to global environmental change. And I mention this because it has very interesting implications for research design. If we look at the excellent book, Slow Violence from Rob Nixon, it's very interesting to me that his entry point into this very interesting analysis is not specific fieldwork sites or, let's say, quantitative data. It's actually literature, that he uses literature and literary criticism as the entry point in terms of trying to understand processes of environmental change in an extremely interesting way. And I think that's one of the distinctive angles, if you like, that the environmental humanities can bring both methodologically and conceptually. And Amitav Ghosh, in the Great Derangement, Ghosh raises very interesting questions about what form should or can the novel take in relation to global environmental change. He and others have argued in a very interesting way that the classic novel really emerged out of modernity and fast-growing industrial cities and so on. But in relation to contemporary patterns of global change, what kind of fiction can speak to the contemporary moment? So he's, in a very interesting way, he's looking at writing itself and changing practices and parameters, if you like, of writing in relation to global environmental change. And then perhaps a final aspect to mention, which is very close to my recent interests, is the possibility of articulating a kind of forensic ecologies that add something to urban political ecology. And in trying to do this, I've been very much influenced by two fields of literature, essentially. One is the extremely innovative forensic architecture program led by Eyal Weizmann that many of you will be familiar with, and their particular interest in sensors and sensing and multidisciplinary approaches to the reconstruction of events or environments. And in a related way, we could argue, the history of forensic entomology and the investigation of crime scenes, which goes back to the 19th century, and the fact that a human body, a cadaver, is associated with a precise sequence of insects over time, which can help in the reconstruction of crime scenes in terms of the date, timing, and even location of death and so on. And bringing these different aspects together and thinking about particularly insects as indicators, I've really tried to articulate in my book the notion that global environmental change and is in many ways a global crime scene, and that these aspects such as mass invertebrate decline are an indicator for these ecological crimes, if we want to call it that, operating at different scales. So this sense then of a forensic approach and building counter-hegemonic knowledge to challenge the organizations, governments, people, corporations, and so on, who are directly implicated in processes of global environmental destruction. And then finally, I wanted to say a few words about the ecological pluriverse, which is my sense of an emerging perspective, which is distinctive in certain ways, and I think worth pausing for a moment to consider. The ecological pluriverse is very much geared towards a recognition of non-human others in urban space, and, if you like, even going beyond the observational paradigms of noticing nature, but also welcoming nature in terms of a multi-species city. And this notion of the pluriverse itself has particularly developed within anthropology. Escobar in particular, but other authors increasingly drawing this conceptual language into discussions about environmental change. And on the question of welcoming animals back into the city, I've really been struck by the essay by Jennifer Walsh, Zoopolis, published back in 1996, that I would suggest is in many ways the really fundamental point of departure for a lot of these ideas, not just across geography, but animal studies more generally. And thinking about inviting the animals back in Walsh's words, as part of a re-enchantment of the city. Extremely interesting set of arguments. Particular animals, the coyote has featured quite prominently, not unexpectedly, because Walsh was developing her ideas in California. But if we look across other cities, foxes in London are an interesting parallel example in some ways with these debates. And also, interestingly, in India, in a number of Indian cities, including Mumbai, that the leopard has become part of the peri-urban ecological constellations. And intriguingly, leopards prey on stray dogs, and stray dogs carry rabies, so that there are some interesting epidemiological dimensions to these peri-urban leopard dog ecologies in Indian cities. Also, the return of wolves, particularly to urban areas in Western Europe, has been a focus of much discussion. last year, I was based at the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study in northern Germany, analysis of animal traces on the edge of metropolitan Hamburg shows that wolves have been present on the edge of Hamburg, and similar studies have been repeated for many other cities. And in the excellent film directed by Nicolette Kleibitz, Wild, it really focuses on an emerging relationship between a young woman and a wolf near a housing complex in Halle, the city of Halle in East Germany. And there's an interesting story about, if you like, de-domestication and the possibilities for human-animal interactions in urban space. A very, very interesting and original cinematic intervention here. And as I say, the ecological pluriverse very much links with attempts to reconceptualize the place of nature in urban space, and the idea, for example, of urban denizens. So a very interesting campaigning group in Paris, Zoopolis, have put up a series of posters on the Paris metro, really arguing for the rights of rats, that they're sociable, they're intelligent, they're sensitive. Why do we need to eradicate them? Essentially, why can't we coexist with rats and other animals within urban space? So related to this, an ethical dimension, just in passing, I would mention conflict over culls of wild animals. In Indian cities, periodically there have been culls of stray dogs, which have created protest. Also under discussion, culls of parakeets, these birds I mentioned, provoking a very fierce debate about how to coexist with non-human others and ethical aspects. Of course, we could also throw into this discussion the question of agro-capitalism and industrialized agriculture and the treatment of animals and food production, also featuring in terms of the ethical and political agendas associated with the ecological pluriverse. We also find very interesting new approaches to landscape design, which explicitly try to harness the spontaneous dynamics of nature to produce new kinds of aesthetic effects. So Park am Gleisdreieck in Berlin uses certain substrates that mimic some of these post-war rubble landscapes to encourage particular plants to colonize these spaces. So a kind of wasteland aesthetic, if you like, built into a contemporary urban design, which I think is very, very interesting and intriguing. And other significant examples, we have animal-aided design, which some of you will be familiar with, in terms of the design of physical structures and buildings and so on for bats, birds, and other organisms. And perhaps one of the most influential figures, the landscape designer and horticulturist Gilles Clément, who has really for many years now has tried to focus attention on the aesthetic interest inherent in the spontaneous dynamics of plants. And in some of his park designs, there's a characteristic kind of edge effect, if you like, which is interesting to me because the edge is what, if you like, indicates to a public audience that there is an idea here. It's not that someone forgot to mow one part of the park, but there's actually an idea in terms of a separation of different mowing regimes and a complex conceptual typology, if you like, in relation to an urban design. In terms of urban rewilding, there's the very high-profile example of the Oostvaardersplassen urban rewilding project in the Netherlands near Amsterdam, which has had a lot of attention because it's tried to recreate some kind of a Pleistocene landscape where herbivores such as wild horses would have been a dominant ecological influence. But it's proved very controversial, and some of you will already know about this because for various reasons, many of the horses starved, and the scientists who were responsible for the project we're really insistent that ecological dynamics must be allowed to find, if you like, their own structural dynamics. But the images of starving horses caused public outrage, so that people were trying to feed the horses through the fences to this large-scale urban rewilding project and so on, bringing, if you like, public sentiment into direct conflict with scientists and what they saw as a kind of laboratory space as part of a kind of metropolitan rewilding project. So to conclude then, so we have a little bit of time for questions. I mentioned at the start of my presentation that there is a vast and growing literature in relation to urban nature and urban ecology. And just to indicate a few other titles that have just come out within the last year or so, there's Hilary Angelo's work on the Ruhr district, with very innovative analysis of why the idea of urban greening itself became regarded as a policy objective. We have Peter Alagona's work, The Accidental Ecosystem, in a similar fashion to Jennifer Walsh, looking at the return of mammals to urban spaces and what this means for cultures of nature in North American cities. And then there is Bettina Sturz's book, Rural City, based specifically on Berlin, and taking these arguments about cosmopolitan ecology and nativism further in relation to the politics of urban nature in a very specific context. And thinking about this emerging literature, I guess one of the pressing questions for me is whether we can build an effective conceptual synthesis between some of these different approaches that I've been talking about. Can we, for example, combine the observational approaches with urban political ecology and the ecological pluriverse? What kind of conceptual synthesis might be possible or desirable to take the study of urban nature or urban ecology forward? I would also stress, and I touched on this tension between global perspectives and more locally oriented perspectives. And I think that we need to be cautious about how conceptual or methodological paradigms travel, particularly from global north to global south. So in my recent work in the Pali-Karanai wetlands in Chennai, which are major sites for migratory birds, and it's something like 90% of the lake system has been lost in the last 40 years. And what I'm interested in here is what's happening, but also to think more specifically in terms of what kind of socio-ecological processes are underway in these metropolitan landscapes in Chennai in India, and to think very hard about the degree to which some of our existing conceptual frameworks work in a different context. And one particular thing that stands out for me is that in quite a lot of the literature looking at the global north, the notion of novel or recombinant ecologies is often regarded in a very positive way, but sometimes these newly emerging urban ecologies are very different. And I've used the term ecological decay to highlight the way that some of these fragmented or denuded urban wetlands with many natural predators missing become breeding grounds for mosquitoes or other disease vectors and so on. So there are processes of ecological decay in metropolitan spaces in the global south that could easily be missed by an overemphasis on the ecological dynamics of, let's say, London, Berlin, or Montreal, for example. And perhaps a final point in relation to the decentering of urban ecological discourse, coming back to some of my recent work in Chennai, I was very intrigued to see that a number of key environmental works, such as Rachel Carson, have been translated into Tamil as part of an emerging Tamil public sphere in relation to processes of urban environmental change. And I think a decentering of urban environmental discourse is part of this sense of building, I think, a richer conceptualization of urban nature. So I think I will stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting lecture. I was writing furiously, taking down notes of books I need to read. Just a question. This is a more really to be more provocative than anything else. But you know, obviously, urban ecology is a big part of the course that we're studying here with Paula. But it's still quite a new subject to a lot of us. And I read an excellent book by an author called Cal Finn, who has a book called Islands of Abandonment, which is about abandoned sites across the world where ecology has been allowed to flourish. But I guess my question is just to hear your take on this. You know, given that cities only occupy a fraction of the Earth's surface, like it's something like 2 or 3%. And obviously cities have a huge impact on the global ecology through, you know, industry and movement of people and so on. But surely the issue in terms of ecological collapse is happening outside the cities. You know, you mentioned, you know, invertebrate collapse and so on. Well, that's due to, you know, industry and agriculture and so on. But like, my question is, why are cities so important in relation to ecology? As a regard, like, should the fight not be happening in the farmland or?
Sure. Thanks very much for the question. Okay, I think conceptually, I think it's useful to see cities and modernity as interrelated. Certainly, there are interesting figures about the surface area of cities and so on, which is interesting in itself. The argument I'm making, however, is not to say that cities in themselves are responsible for patterns of global environmental destruction. I'm trying to make a slightly different argument, actually, that cities are centers for innovation and the production of new environmental ideas, which I think are potentially very helpful in terms of wider political discourse. When we think about cosmopolitan ecologies in cities, there's an echo in the social and cultural sphere in terms of what kind of natures or landscapes or societies we want to sustain. And just to give a very quick illustration, in Milan, in northern Italy, far-right political activists have targeted non-native trees, attacked them in Milan as they would see it, to prevent the Africanization of the metropolitan landscape, which I think illustrates how ideologically charged these questions around ecology, landscape, and nativism are. So what I'm really trying to suggest then is that cities are spaces in which alternative cultural and political formations can emerge, which may yet have much broader significance. If we're talking about environmental politics more broadly, it's very striking that when you look at the electoral map, that metropolitan electorates tend to be much more progressive towards environmental protection measures than non-metropolitan voters, and we see that repeated many times. So for clarification then, I'm suggesting that cities are potentially part of the solution, I think, in terms of global environmental problems.
Thank you.
If I might pick up on that, Matthew, and I was kind of wondering, I guess something possibly a bit similar to Rob, but also if you sort of push the idea of these waste spaces and this idea of, I guess, the transition or sort of the social ecological transition, and this idea that, okay, we are changing our mobility habits, we're changing our living habits, and so cities are going to, you know, there will be a creation of waste space in urban areas, in the sense of car parks becoming less required. I'm wondering if you're to push it further, would then, and I kind of struggle with the term waste space in terms of city, but would you then suggest almost not densifying cities? Or it feels like we should not densify cities in that sense, but leave these waste spaces be spaces in of themselves that can be re-inhabited by other species, and that we kind of keep almost let the cities disperse to some degree. I don't know, as you were giving lots of references, I was trying to figure out what does that mean for architects, urban planners, territorial designers, and how do we sort of take it, because your references were literature and were video, and then you brought up forensic architecture, but in their sort of their work, their senses or their sensory work. And yeah, I was kind of just wondering what it means for people who are sort of on the ground trying to reformulate a city and take sort of use what you're working with, or use these ideas of these waste spaces. Hopefully maybe they get calling it something other than a waste space.
Sure, yeah, very interesting question. I think that in terms of how to conceptualize urban spaces, and possibly slightly differently, I think that if we're interested in increasing and protecting high levels of urban biodiversity, then clearly we need to think about these marginal spaces differently as very positive parts of urban space. And we can also, not only in terms of biodiversity, but thinking about land use differently, we can think about aspects of so-called soft engineering and different approaches to flood risk in cities, because many of these, even micro swale type landscapes, can be really important in terms of improving surface drainage in cities if we're going to have more unpredictable future rainfall events and things of that kind, and also potentially thinking about how to approach natural floodplains in relation to metropolitan planning. So I think there's some really interesting intersections between ecology and land use planning and landscape design that we can think about. On the question of density, in Germany, there's some very interesting emerging debates which really do effectively both. They're pushing for certain kinds of denser block-like structures, but simultaneously more green space. So rather than an either or, dense or open, there's some very interesting discourses around a kind of the double density, but which includes a real focus on metropolitan green space. The other quick point, however, that I would say in terms of the kind of practical implications of what I've talked about, if we were to say, how does urban political ecology relate to landscape design? How do these more abstract discussions about capitalist urbanization or urban metabolism relate to urban design? I would translate this conceptual field into quite a simple formulation, which is effectively follow the money. That if we want to actually understand more deleterious or unwanted patterns of land use within cities, then we need to actually trace through who is benefiting from these developments. I was interested in my presentation, I mentioned that this Chausseestrasse site had been cleared away for a luxury housing development. But when you try to find out about who is funding this housing development, there's a network of different banks involved in different European countries and so on. So there are So following the money, I think, can be very illuminating in trying to make sense of how decisions are being made, who is making decisions, and who is benefiting ultimately from things we might not want to see within urban space.
Are there any? Yeah.
You were showing a series of authors, and the second moment after the Marina you stopped and you said, but this way, this group of authors, there is a normalization of the capitalist environment, and then you start with your own perspective. So the way you are proposing to realize this capitalist environment, but can you be more explicit about this regionalization of the capitalist environment?
Were you able to hear that last question, Matthew?
I'm very sorry, I couldn't hear anything. Somebody will have to translate for me.
So there were some noises. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, I can.
Oh, okay. No, I was just referring to the beginning of your lecture when you were quoting Marina Alberti, and then you stopped and you said, okay, but this is a group of authors that I criticize, and you mentioned the fact that there was a kind of a naturalization of the capitalist environment.
Yes.
And then you started with your own approach in terms of observational paradigms. Can you maybe be more explicit about this need to denaturalize this, say, the system, or to denaturalize the capitalist environment inside which many of the ecological studies have been framed, let's say?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a fair point, because I think that quite a lot of the observational approach, if you like, or observational paradigms is simply looking at what kind of ecological spaces emerge in relation to capitalist urbanization. A lot of these approaches are not necessarily making an argument about a different kind of urban structure, but just interested in the actually existing ecologies associated with urban and industrial landscapes, for example. I think that where the critique begins to become apparent, I think perhaps is when we look at the Berlin School of Urban Ecology, where there are arguments made that these marginal sites are more than just places without capitalist value, but they are scientific laboratories in themselves that in some cases have been studied for 20 or 30 years and have some kind of intrinsic cultural or intellectual value that means that they should be protected. And there we find some of the emerging tensions, if you like, between attempts to valorize or protect aspects of nature, or simply just being interested in actually existing nature, if that makes sense. And then as we move on to the urban political ecology framework, there's a more explicit engagement with the idea of capitalist urbanization as being contested and also historically specific. And possibly this is also a point of interest for the environmental humanities as well, because, for example, in science fiction literature, we often encounter these imaginary alternative worlds. And I mean, it's very clear that if we can't imagine anything different from the capitalist city, then how could we possibly make a different kind of urban space?
I think we share a common appreciation for Ballard, probably. which I think is a fundamental reading for all architects, urban designers, etc. But also I was quite interested to the series of people you have been quoting, especially from the field of political ecology, people that we have invited in here, like Arturo Escobar, for example, or Stuart Pickett, which and it's very interesting. But or for example, Eric Zwingado. Last year we had twice Eric Zwingado with the students, and I think that they are much more, let's say, violent and aggressive in their criticism. You have a kind of sweetness, which I don't know how to, if it is because you are English, or if it is because you are still looking for exactly the point of attack.
Yeah, curious observation. I hadn't really anticipated that. I mean, I think that I think epistemologically, you know, as an academic, I think that I like to hold on to notions of complexity, and I think that in terms of my own writing and work, I am interested in trying to retain a degree of nuance and complexity in relation to many of these questions. And I think one of the perhaps one of the areas where I might diverge slightly from some of the other academics you mentioned is I think that sometimes within the neo-Marxian framework, it's presented as self-evident that, that ultimately everything is the result of capital. And I'm not so sure. I think there are other factors. I think there are ideological factors. There are aspects of violence and racism which are not simply a matter of capital, but relate to other elements of nationalist ideologies, fascist aesthetics, some of the things that the historian Mark Mizawa writes about in his book Dark Continent, for example. So I guess from an analytical point of view, that might explain why I might appear a bit more tentative to put forward some kind of definitive list of things. I want to keep the discussion open and complex, I think, because that I think is helpful.
Thank you very much. This is really explaining something, and this may be also the reason why is in a way I can imagine also for the quotations you brought, it becomes easier to discuss in terms of design, for example, a designer perspective, while, for example, with Eric Zwingado is very difficult. And each time I have to remind him that we as designers, we are in a very different position from the one of the geographer. No, I mean, the criticism you can have, we can have, but in a different way, because we are really on the frontier, no? Between, let's say, critical understanding, because of course we have critical understanding, but also a very direct and very, let's say, tough relation with let's say, the rest of the world. And every project, every projective imagination is transformative. So that there is this aspect of transformation. We hope, of course, for the best, but we can always fail, of course. No? So it's very, I'm very, how can I say, very passionate of political ecology, but sometimes I think that some of the authors do not understand, in fact, the difficulty of changing, of transforming cities and territories. So in a way, I think that it will be easier to discuss with you than with Eric Zwingado about design, for example. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, I think just to mention, I think that I was recently involved in a very interesting discussion with other people involved in relation to the intellectual legacy of Ash Amin, the geographer who recently retired from Cambridge University. And one of my reflections from thinking about his body of work was looking for, if you like, spaces of hope amid a very concerning, or in many ways, very pessimistic larger landscape, that somehow we need to find these spaces of hope or possibility in order to begin to imagine different worlds. And it may be that if landscape succeeds in certain instances, it can provide those windows, if you like, into alternative conceptualizations in a very immediate, tactile or grounded sense. But I would also add that I think that the solution to many of the problems we talk about is actually nothing to do with design. I mean, it's to do with questions of social policy, economic policy, stuff that lies effectively outside the remit of design. If we're talking about public policy, there's very interesting discussion about a guaranteed basic income in terms of fundamentally restructuring modern societies. And my feeling is that without that, I don't think there's a political bridge towards a different kind of political or economic structure. And questions like that are not fundamentally really to do with design.
Thank you very much. I think there are some other students that would like to ask you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Now I started developing a thought on this discussion on violence, since you also mentioned a lot of examples of Berlin. And now we can maybe say, okay, those wastelands that then hosted new biodiversities or milieus, they were maybe spaces of hope. But if we go back in history, there was an extreme violence to create these spaces, to say a city that was destroyed in the war, a city, West Berlin, that then was isolated in another country, basically. It's the creation of those spaces somehow are extremely violent, and it's the same with other areas that maybe are the consequence of a economic decay. It depends a bit in which moment you read it. And now, since we regarding biodiversity loss and climate change, it seems that we have very little time and there's a huge pressure on cities. So I wonder, do we, in the moment where we create space for biodiversity, is there this need for violence, and how do we, or is there a soft way to create those spaces?
Well, I think you raise a really interesting question, that you're quite right, that many of these important spaces of post-war biodiversity or wastelands and so on are produced through forms of violence or trauma, warfare, economic dislocation, geopolitical separation and so on. And that's really interesting. And that, one of the questions I've been thinking about is that if such spaces are colonized by plants and become like a green oasis within the city, in a way, you could, on the one hand, you could say that vegetation is softening these violent landscapes, but possibly also hiding the historical origins of such spaces. And that, I think, is a really curious ambiguity. So in the west of Berlin, you have the so-called Teufelsberg, or Devil's Mountain, which is the rubble cleared away from wartime aerial bombing raids. So there's a huge heap of rubble, which now is covered in a kind of dense forest, effectively. So it looks, superficially like a sort of natural urban sort of forest type landscape. But if you walk through it, on the ground, you see these small fragments of a pottery or ceramics or pieces that once belonged as part of somebody's home, for example. So this relationship between violence and alternative urban ecologies is extremely interesting. But in terms of more generally, though, there's a lot of discussion, I think, about the idea that greater contact with nature actually has many social, psychological, cultural, and political benefits. And that's a very interesting argument. And I think that one argument I would make is that if people have no direct contact with nature, given that getting on for 60% of the global population lives in cities now, if most of the world's population have really no contact with nature, how could they be interested or mobilized to protect biodiversity at a global scale? So in that sense, I don't see a contradiction, if you like, between protecting an unusual ecological assemblage in a city that people want to protect for cultural and scientific reasons, and at the same time trying to protect a more distant biotope, such as tropical rainforest in Brazil, Peru, or Ecuador, or somewhere else. I think that these are not contradictory political or scientific dynamics, that we can recognize a diversity of biotopes that we think are valuable, that we want to protect. But I think no direct contact, if the only nature people know is through digital projections or representations, I think that's kind of quite ghostly, because we might enter a strange situation, a kind of negative science fiction dystopia, where effectively nature as such no longer exists. It's only a digital projection amid some kind of, solar storm of a kind of disfigured meteorological system. I noticed the remake of Blade Runner, though I think overall very disappointing, but there were some interesting features in it. A notion that the collapse of global agriculture had led to a need to create new food sources, such as laboratory-reared insect larvae and other sources of food and things of that kind. So there's some interesting ideas tucked away within this dystopian future projection. But I do think that if you like, if contact with nature itself is lost, then I don't see much prospect for a progressive global politics of protecting nature.
Thank you.
No questions. Okay, one left.
Hi, just a quick question in relation to all of these unusual plant species that emerge kind of almost unexpectedly, it seems, in a lot of cases. Just a very simple question, like, where do they come from? Do they get blown there, or are they kind of unearthed from hundreds of years in the past?
Yeah, nice question. Urban soils can contain seeds that are hundreds of years old that will germinate in the right conditions. And the Brazilian artist Alves I mentioned, she has actually specifically explored those kind of dynamics. But in terms of like a bare patch of earth, let's say, or an empty space, seeds will arrive by wind, the feet of birds, and even human shoes if people enter a site and walk through it, and things of that kind. So from different directions. And I think from an ecological point of view, what has fascinated ecologists is the unpredictability of what sort of micro ecological assemblage will emerge in relation to one marginal site. Which is, I think, part of the fascination, I think, for these urban ecological studies, that you can never really predict what kind of ecological assemblage might emerge on marginal sites.
This came to my mind when you brought the example of Teresa Alves, the seeds of change, if I'm not wrong. I thought about some, and also you showed some of the environmentalist movements in Louisiana, and I was thinking about the movements in the 70s in New York and especially in Brooklyn, that was able through the community gardens to reconsider the whole neighborhood and the importance of the gardens not changing the economic dynamic of a neighborhood. So much that today it's actually that specific neighborhood in Brooklyn, the Bed-Stuy, it's in a risk of gentrification, and these community gardens is being shaped. And my question is that danger of urban ecology changing the economy in a direction that maybe it's not so desirable, and according to related to an activist way to achieve those results in urban ecology. For example, the example that I brought from Brooklyn, which came back in a few days, which was like seed bombs, throwing seed bombs in voids and empty lots in New York, and through the seasons they would grow like a new garden out of the control of the ownership of that lot. So I was wondering possibilities of like activism and urban ecology.
Thanks. Excellent question. Very interesting. I mean, when I was doing research in New York City, I went to Bedford-Stuyvesant and saw, so the Magnolia Tree Earth Garden actually was one of the gardens that I was interested in. And you're absolutely right that there's a tension here that the cultivation of community gardens and so on, and bringing sort of empty lots back into the public realm, you know, through gardening and other activities, enriches local communities, but it also paradoxically begins to initiate other processes that often local communities can't control in terms of gentrification pressures. It's a very, very complex and interesting dynamic you point to. Another example, in my presentation, I talked about the innovative designs in Park am Gleisdreieck in Berlin with the recreation of these wasteland aesthetics and you know, quite a high degree of sort of community consultation in terms of design and so on. But nevertheless, because the park is an award-winning park and is so successful that, of course, rents are beginning to rise quite rapidly in the streets around the park itself. And I think this fundamental tension, if you like, between innovative ecological interventions and the underlying speculative dynamics of capitalist urbanization are very, very difficult to reconcile. And I think maybe that's an additional answer to the earlier question about what can urban political ecology bring to an enlightened design discourse. And I think it would be setting a warning, really, about how cities actually function and what happens if you improve neighborhoods through the building of community gardens and very attractive green oases within the fabric of the city. On the question of seed bombs, that's a very interesting example because I have some ambivalence about it, because sometimes some of the artistic interventions stress that these are native seed bombs. And I have a kind of double take of what is meant by throwing a native seed bomb in a metropolitan context. What does that really mean exactly? So I'm slightly hesitant about that, partly because of my concern with the native, non-native distinction and how this operates within the cultural as well as the ecological sphere within metropolitan space.
I hope we are not profiting too much of your time. So just tell us if you have to leave. In fact, we are very cold in this very big amphitheater room, and I hope you are more comfortable than us. I would like to have your say about the two dimensions that I know are very important for your research. The one is the body, and the second is history. So maybe if you can also for us and for the students to enlarge, to expand a little bit about these two dimensions, also in your work, in relation to your work.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, immensely complex, really. I mean, I think very briefly then, just try to think about how it's important for me in terms of the work that I do. I think through my kind of long-standing interests in urban infrastructure and the co-evolutionary dynamics of the body in urban space, I've always been very interested in these notions about how the history of the body is intertwined with the history of urban space, and that spaces and technologies can influence the comportment of the body in unexpected or sometimes unintentional ways. And I think this links perhaps with some of the neo-Foucauldian approaches to history as well. And I think that's one angle. Methodologically, I'm interested in corporeal or ethnographic approaches to interaction with space. I spoke very briefly at the start about the importance of, for me, of being immersed in specific sites or locations that I'm thinking about and writing about. A lot of my theoretical ideas emerge from interaction with material spaces, and these are corporeal interactions or affective interactions with space. On the history side, I suppose it's just a matter for me of great fascination to try to trace the histories of ideas and spaces, the historic emergence of particular conceptualizations of metropolitan nature, thinking about history as a contested process, sometimes with surprises, unexpected turns, and so on. If you like, a non-teleological reading of historical change, and also using historical sources in terms of my research. Archives have been a source of inspiration. Also what you might refer to as oral histories. So when I was investigating the environmental justice movement in North America, it was, a matter of great pride, really, to be able to talk to some of the original activists and learn about their memory, about their involvement in these campaigns, and how they viewed the legacy of their own campaigns, and that aspect as well. So I think both intellectually and methodologically, then, the body and history are important to me, I would say.
Thank you very much. I think we might continue, but we will do that next time, I hope. And for the moment, we thank you so much for this evening. And I don't know if there is someone else who wants to add something, or if you can. And maybe just a Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
We're very silent.